The most beautiful woman in the world was dying in a bathtub on a Tuesday night in Beverly Hills, and nobody knew except the man who kicked down her bathroom door at 2:47 a.m. The newspapers would never report what happened in that marble sanctuary of Elizabeth Taylor's Bel Air mansion on October 15, 1964. They would never write about the empty pill bottles scattered across Italian marble like confetti after a funeral. They would never describe the lukewarm water turning pink with blood from self-inflicted scratches, or the haunting silence that filled a house worth more than most small towns. But Dean Martin was there. Dean Martin saw it all, and in the 3 hours that followed, the King of Cool performed the most important show of his life, not for an audience of thousands in a Las Vegas showroom, but for an audience of one broken woman who had forgotten why living was worth the pain. This is the story of how a cigarette, a cup of coffee, and the gentle wisdom of a man from Steubenville, Ohio, pulled the violet-eyed goddess back from the edge of eternity. The house on Carrollwood Drive was a monument to Hollywood excess. Elizabeth Taylor had bought it with the millions she earned destroying herself on screen, a sprawling mansion that echoed with the ghosts of failed marriages and broken dreams. On this particular night, the silence was deafening. The servants had been dismissed. The security guards were patrolling the perimeter, unaware that the real danger was inside, drowning in a bathtub worth more than most people's annual salaries. Elizabeth had been planning this night for weeks. The pills were carefully stockpiled. Seconal, Nembutal, enough barbiturates to kill a horse. The bathtub was drawn with water at exactly the right temperature. The house was empty. Even her beloved children were safely away, spared the trauma of discovery. Everything was perfect for a beautiful death, a final performance worthy of the greatest actress of her generation. What Elizabeth didn't know was that Dean Martin had been worried about her for months. They weren't close friends. Their paths crossed occasionally at parties, premieres, and industry gatherings, but Dean had the eyes of a man who understood pain. He saw through the glamorous facade to the wounded woman underneath, and on this night, when insomnia and intuition converged, Dean decided to check on the most famous woman in the world. To understand why Elizabeth Taylor wanted to die, you have to understand what her life had become by October 1964. She was 32 years old, and already felt like she had lived several lifetimes. The girl who had charmed the world in national velvet had become a woman who couldn't walk down the street without causing riots. Every relationship was dissected by the press, every meal was photographed, every emotion was analyzed by columnists who treated her personal life like a soap opera written for their entertainment. The Cleopatra disaster had nearly destroyed her career and her sanity. The most expensive movie ever made had become a public relations nightmare, with Elizabeth portrayed as the seductress who had wrecked Richard Burton's marriage and driven the studio to near bankruptcy. The press painted her as a homewrecker, a diva, a woman whose appetites for food, for men, for attention were as legendary as her beauty. But the real poison in Elizabeth's veins wasn't the pills or the alcohol. It was the loneliness. Despite being married to Richard Burton, despite having more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, despite being desired by men around the world, Elizabeth Taylor felt utterly, completely alone. She was trapped in a glass cage of fame, admired but not understood, worshipped but not loved for who she really was, underneath the violet eyes and perfect bone structure. The irony was devastating. Elizabeth Taylor, who had spent her life making others feel less alone through her performances, couldn't find anyone to save her from her own isolation. Everyone wanted something from her, a photo, an autograph, a piece of her soul to sell to the highest bidder. No one simply wanted to sit with her in silence and let her be human. Dean Martin understood this particular kind of loneliness. Despite his image as the life of the party, Dean was fundamentally a solitary man. He had learned early that fame was a double-edged sword that could cut you as deeply as it elevated you. But Dean had found ways to cope with the isolation: golf, family, and most importantly, the ability to see through other people's masks to the authentic person underneath. On the night Elizabeth almost died, Dean couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual. Insomnia was an occupational hazard for entertainers whose internal clocks were permanently scrambled by late-night shows and cross-country flights. But this was different. Dean felt an inexplicable urge to drive, to move, to go somewhere his conscious mind hadn't yet identified. He had been at a dinner party earlier that evening at Frank Sinatra's house. Elizabeth had been there too, stunning in a white dress that made her look like a tragic angel. But Dean had noticed things others missed: the way she held her wine glass too tightly, the forced quality of her laughter, the haunted look in her famous eyes when she thought no one was watching. Most people saw Elizabeth Taylor, the movie star, the sex symbol, the woman who had everything. Dean saw Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor, the frightened girl from England who had been thrust into an adult world before she understood what childhood was supposed to feel like. He saw someone drowning in plain sight while everyone around her applauded her performance. At 2:30 a.m., Dean found himself driving through the winding roads of Bel Air in his black Cadillac. He told himself he was just clearing his head, but his subconscious was navigating toward Carrollwood Drive with the precision of a guided missile. When he pulled up to Elizabeth's estate, he saw that most of the house was dark, except for a few lights on the second floor. Something about the scene felt wrong. Elizabeth's house was never completely quiet. There were always servants moving around, security guards making rounds, the general bustle of a home that functioned as both residence and business headquarters. But tonight, the silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the eucalyptus trees that lined the driveway. Dean parked his car and approached the front door. His finger hovered over the doorbell for a moment before he decided against it. If Elizabeth was asleep, he didn't want to wake her. If she was awake and wanted privacy, a doorbell would feel like an invasion. Instead, he walked around the perimeter of the house, looking for signs of life. That's when he heard it, a splash from the direction of the master bathroom, followed by an ominous silence. Dean's blood turned cold. He had heard that particular silence before, in the bathroom of a hotel in Chicago where a friend had tried to end his own life with a razor blade. It was the silence of someone who had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Dean didn't hesitate. He didn't call for help, or worry about property laws, or wonder if he was overreacting. He found the nearest window, a French door leading to Elizabeth's study, and broke it with a garden stone. The alarm system had been disabled, another ominous sign that Elizabeth had planned this night carefully. The house felt like a mausoleum as Dean moved through it. Expensive art hung on the walls like tombstones. Persian rugs muffled his footsteps. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly lifeless. Dean followed the sound of running water to the master suite, where the bathroom door was locked from the inside. "Elizabeth." Dean called out, his voice echoing off marble surfaces. No response. "Elizabeth, it's Dean Martin. I'm coming in." The door was solid wood, reinforced with brass fittings that spoke of both luxury and security. Dean kicked it once, twice, 3 times before the lock gave way and the door splintered open. What he saw inside made him forget every joke he had ever told, every song he had ever sung, every moment of calculated coolness that had defined his public persona. Elizabeth Taylor lay in a bathtub filled with pink-tinged water, her famous violet eyes closed, her breathing so shallow it was barely detectable. Empty prescription bottles were scattered across the marble floor, like evidence at a crime scene. A wine glass, still half full of burgundy, sat precariously on the edge of the tub. She had dressed for death like she was attending a premiere, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the precision of a professional artist preparing for her final close-up. But she was alive, barely, but alive. Dean didn't panic. He had seen enough violence in his youth to know that panic was the enemy of effective action. He pulled Elizabeth from the bathtub, wrapping her in a thick white towel that immediately turned pink from the water. She was conscious but barely responsive, her pupils dilated from whatever cocktail of drugs she had consumed. "Elizabeth," Dean said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the pharmaceutical fog clouding her consciousness. "Look at me. Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, those legendary violet eyes that had launched 1,000 magazine covers. For a moment she looked confused, as if she couldn't quite process how Dean Martin had materialized in her bathroom like a guardian angel in a tuxedo. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Neither are you," Dean replied, lifting her in his arms and carrying her to the bedroom. "Not like this." The next 3 hours were the longest of Dean Martin's life. He knew that Elizabeth needed medical attention, but he also knew that involving doctors or hospitals would mean involving the press. By morning, every newspaper in the world would be running headlines about Elizabeth Taylor's suicide attempt. Her career would be over, her children would be traumatized, and the woman who had survived so much would be destroyed by the one thing she couldn't escape: public judgment. So Dean became a one-man medical team. He induced vomiting to purge whatever pills remained in Elizabeth's system. He kept her conscious by talking to her, slapping her face gently when her eyes started to close, forcing her to drink coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. He monitored her pulse, her breathing, her pupil response, drawing on knowledge he had acquired during his boxing days when he had seen men fight through injuries that should have killed them. But the physical care was only half the battle. The harder part was keeping Elizabeth's spirit connected to her body, convincing her that life was worth the struggle, and for that Dean had to reach deeper into his soul than he had ever reached before. Why? Dean asked when Elizabeth was alert enough to have a conversation. They were sitting in her bedroom, Dean in an antique chair beside the bed, Elizabeth propped up against silk pillows, a cup of coffee warming her hands. "You have everything. Money, fame, talent, beauty. Why throw it all away?" Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Everything? You think this is everything?" She gestured around the opulent bedroom. "This is a prison, Dean. A beautiful, expensive prison, but a prison nonetheless." "Then break out," Dean said simply. "Walk away, disappear, become someone else." "I can't," Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face, washing away the carefully applied makeup to reveal the vulnerable woman underneath. "I don't know who I am without the cameras, without the roles, without people telling me I'm beautiful. I've been performing since I was 12 years old. The performance is all I am." It was then that Dean understood. Elizabeth Taylor hadn't tried to kill herself because she was unhappy with her life. She had tried to kill herself because she didn't have a life, only an endless series of performances designed to please other people. She had become so disconnected from her authentic self that she couldn't imagine existing without an audience. Dean stood up and walked to Elizabeth's vanity, where dozens of photographs chronicled her journey from child star to global icon. He picked up one from her early days at MGM, when she was still a teenager with dreams bigger than her tiny frame could contain. "You see this girl?" Dean said, showing Elizabeth the photograph. "She's still in there. She's been buried under layers of makeup and costumes and other people's expectations, but she's still there, and she's the one who needs to decide whether she wants to live or die." "I don't remember her," Elizabeth whispered. "I don't remember who I was before I became what everyone wanted me to be." Dean sat back down and took Elizabeth's hands in his. His fingers were calloused from years of manual labor before he became a singer, scarred from boxing matches and street fights, marked by a life that had been lived rather than performed. "Then let me tell you who she was," Dean said quietly. "She was a little girl who loved horses and wanted to be a veterinarian. She was smart, funny, kind to people who couldn't do anything for her. She had dreams that had nothing to do with cameras or red carpets. She was real." Dean spent the rest of the night telling Elizabeth stories about herself, not the myths and legends that had grown up around her public image, but the authentic moments he had observed over the years. The way she lit up when she talked about her children, the genuine compassion she showed for crew members on movie sets, the intelligence that flickered behind her famous eyes when she thought no one was watching. "You want to know the difference between you and me?" Dean said, as the first rays of dawn crept through the bedroom windows. "I never forgot that I was Dino Crosetti from Steubenville before I became Dean Martin. You forgot that you were Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor before you became Elizabeth Taylor, movie star." It was a revelation that changed everything. For the first time in years, Elizabeth began to remember who she had been before the world told her who she should be. She remembered the girl who loved to read, who dreamed of traveling to exotic places, not for movie premieres, but for the simple joy of discovery. She remembered what it felt like to laugh without calculating the effect, to cry without worrying about how it would look in photographs. As the sun rose over Beverly Hills, casting golden light through the silk curtains of Elizabeth's bedroom, she made a decision that would save her life. Not the dramatic, theatrical decision of a movie star, but the quiet, practical decision of a woman who wanted to live. "I want to go somewhere," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger than it had been all night. "Somewhere where no one knows who I am. Somewhere where I can remember how to be human." Dean smiled for the first time since he had kicked down her bathroom door. "Where do you want to go?" "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "Somewhere real. Somewhere that won't show up in the gossip columns." Dean thought for a moment, then grinned. "How do you feel about Ohio?" What happened next was one of the most extraordinary chapters in Hollywood history, though it would remain a secret for decades. Dean Martin smuggled Elizabeth Taylor out of Beverly Hills in the trunk of his Cadillac, drove her to a small airport in the San Fernando Valley, and put her on a private plane to Steubenville, Ohio, where she would spend the next 6 weeks living in anonymity as Liz, a friend of Dean's family, who was recovering from exhaustion. In Steubenville, Elizabeth learned how to grocery shop without being mobbed by fans. She learned how to have conversations about something other than movies and gossip. She learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. Most importantly, she learned that she could exist without an audience, that her value as a human being wasn't dependent on other people's approval. When Elizabeth returned to Hollywood 6 weeks later, she was changed. She still made movies, still married and divorced with spectacular regularity, still lived her life in the public eye. But she never again lost sight of the real woman underneath the celebrity facade. She never again forgot that Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was more important than Elizabeth Taylor, movie star. The night Dean Martin saved Elizabeth Taylor from suicide became one of Hollywood's most closely guarded secrets. Elizabeth made Dean promise never to tell anyone what had happened, and he kept that promise until the day he died. The official story was that Elizabeth had taken a brief vacation to recover from exhaustion after completing a film. The press never suspected that one of the most famous women in the world had spent 6 weeks in a small Ohio town, learning how to be human again. But those who were closest to Elizabeth noticed the change. Richard Burton, who married her twice, later said that the woman who returned from her mysterious hiatus was different, more grounded, more authentic, more capable of genuine intimacy. Elizabeth's children noticed that their mother seemed more present, more engaged with their lives, rather than distracted by the demands of fame. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that night, but those closest to him knew that something had changed in him as well. The experience of saving Elizabeth's life had reminded him of his own mortality, his own vulnerability underneath the mask of cool sophistication he wore for the world. It had shown him that even the most beautiful, successful, seemingly invincible people could be brought low by loneliness and despair. Years later, when Elizabeth Taylor became one of the first celebrities to speak openly about AIDS, when she used her fame to raise millions of dollars for research and treatment, Dean Martin watched from afar with quiet pride. The woman who had once wanted to die had found a reason to live that transcended her own pain, helping others who were facing their own battles with mortality. The story of that night teaches us something profound about the nature of fame, friendship, and human connection. In a world that worships celebrity but often destroys the celebrities it creates, true friendship becomes the rarest and most valuable commodity. Dean Martin didn't save Elizabeth Taylor because she was a movie star, or because it would benefit his career. He saved her because he recognized a fellow human being in pain, and he had the courage to reach across the void of loneliness that separates us all. In the end, the most beautiful woman in the world was saved not by her beauty, her fame, or her fortune, but by the simple human kindness of a man who saw past all of that to the frightened girl underneath. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing of all, the reminder that beneath the masks we all wear, we are all just people, vulnerable and mortal, and desperately in need of someone who cares enough to kick down the door when we're drowning in our own despair. The newspapers never reported what happened on Carrollwood Drive that night, but the life that was saved went on to touch millions of other lives, to create art that will endure long after the gossip columns have crumbled to dust. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that never make headlines, the quiet acts of heroism that happen in the darkness when no one is watching except the people who matter most. Dean Martin went to his grave keeping Elizabeth Taylor's secret, just as she had asked, but the secret itself, the knowledge that even the most desperate situation can be transformed by human compassion, that secret lives on, a reminder that we all have the power to save each other if we're brave enough to break down the doors that separate us from those who are drowning in silence.